from a trip to Africa, to Zanzibar, and to Kenya. Kenya, particular beautiful country, very poor, politically troubled, and I was struck by a report that came out in late July suggesting that the United States has been placed on a rights watch list over the health of its civil society, which has put it on a par with El Salvador, another very troubled country, and Kenya. Has America, and please don't take this personally, in El Salvador and Kenya, has it fallen that far? One person who has spent a lot of time looking at America is my guest today, Diane Francis, a very distinguished foreign policy journalist. She spent some time in Silicon Valley, but she's based in Toronto, Canada. She has an excellent Substack page in which she discusses America's role in the world and the changing international environment. She's joining us from Toronto. Diane, I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to look at this rights watch list, but does it surprise you that America, the United States now, is on a par with El Salvador and Kenya when it comes to civic freedoms?
Well, I think that's pretty much an exaggeration. The United States has pockets of air, has regions that may be a little similar to third world countries. I'm thinking particularly of the Deep South, but in the past. But generally, that's an overstatement.
What's the view, Kerr? I don't want to. You seem to have broad shoulders. I don't want to make you entirely responsible for the Canadian nation. We couldn't get Mark Carney for the show, so you're our substitute, Diane. What's the view on what's happening in the United States from Canada, from Toronto? What's the consensus?
Well, I'm an American originally, and I was born in Chicago. And when I was 19, my then husband, who was British, and I moved to Canada because he was going to be conscripted into this Vietnam War. It wasn't a draft dodger, but it was imminent, so we got out. And we went to Toronto, and we made a very big success of ourselves because it's a country that's as developed and as sophisticated and as interesting and full of opportunities as the United States is. So that's one thing that I've learned over the years. And my opinion of the United States hasn't changed terribly much. Look, we left. It was legal. My husband had a green card, and when we moved to Toronto, he wrote to his Selective Service Board, and they said, "Sure, we'll call you a departed alien, and you have to reapply if you want to get back entry into the United States." So they were all very nice about it, civilized about it. I've really never had any quarrel with the civil rights and the legal system in the United States.
But coming back, that was then. Now is the America of Donald Trump. What's the take on what Trump is doing or has done to the United States? Is this a country now that is foreign to the America that you grew up in, Diane?
Not really. I grew up in Chicago. The way I look at the United States is that it's always been a pretty unruly place. Unlike, Canada or Australia or, even Britain, it was founded on liberties, widely defined. Canada's, by contrast, Canada is a colonial country, and so is Australia. So we had a lot of restrictions. We have restrictions on libel and slander. We don't let people talk the way they do in the United States. You can sue them and stop them from doing it. I don't disagree with that, even though I'm a journalist and have been sued. The point is that it's a very unruly country. It always has been. And, let's not forget that I never forget the fact I was in high school. They were still lynching black men in the Deep South with impunity. So the United States has slowly and regionally, disparately, crawled out of being a very rough and ready, crazy place. And, it still has elements of that, but it's a much improved situation.
But what about, again, and I'm probably contradicting myself here, I don't want to turn this just into a Donald Trump conversation. Is there anything about what's happened with Trump, particularly this latest election, that has changed your mind about America? Some people see this descent into hatred of foreigners, make America great again, isolationism. You're focused on international politics. Is Trump a genuine isolationist, or is that just another of his populist taglines which come out of his reality television presidency?
Well, as a child of the American culture and an observer now, and I participate. I still live there. I think that it's a terrific country. There are certain elements to the American culture and personality, if you like, which includes exaggerations and bullying, and includes spates of totalitarianism wherever they can get away with it. I mean, if you study parts of the South, including New Orleans, the governor, Huey Long, was virtually like a South American dictator. You have certain mayors in certain cities that behaved like dictators. And so you get this kind of maelstrom of high emotionalism and so on. And again, the other thread that runs through American history is isolationism. America entered the First World War very late because most white Americans are German. They're not British background, they're Germanic. And they had cousins in Germany and they didn't want to fight their cousins. And so that was behind it. But also there is an isolationism. Why should we get bothered and why should we get involved? That's a strain that runs through the United States, and it's very popular. And people don't like their sons dying in some foreign country, usually for a stupid reason, because the other thing is isolationism has been enhanced because of the silly wars that America has gotten involved in, including Vietnam, the one that I left the country over, and then Iraq. I mean, in Afghanistan, what did any of that do for anything, to further anything? And so people are very cynical about it. And that, of course, feeds a natural isolationism.
But in a way, you're presenting this isolationism, maybe not so much in terms of the Second World War, but certainly in the context of Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan, as actually quite reasonable.
Isolationism is reasonable. I think it is. I mean, traipsing all over the world, thinking you're the policeman and you have the answer and you pick the right side all the time, and you're going to squander the wealth and the tax dollars of your population is, to me, an ego trip to a certain extent. I mean, it's often championed as heroic and world saving and all that sort of thing. But I remember interviewing Bill Clinton years ago at Davos. I used to attend that conference all the time. And, I said, what's it like? And he said, the first week you're president of the United States, you have 200 or more countries, people from 200 or more countries coming in front of you, asking you to be the policeman or Santa Claus. And so, that's not running a country the way you necessarily want to. So Trump is really putting America first in every sense of the way. And that's annoyed some people.
Is Trump dressed at least as a policeman or Santa Claus, or perhaps as a combination of both, or maybe even as a clown? Is there some logic to what he's doing? As I said, you have an excellent Substack page. You write about all the structural changes in international environment, the rearmament of Germany and Japan, what you call the Donroe Doctrine, the rotting of Russia. Is there some logic to what he's doing?
There is some logic to what he's doing, but he's really not, in my opinion, he's not capable of really statesman-like leadership. He just isn't. He's a fish out of water. He's a developer of slum apartment buildings in Queens. This guy looks at everything as though it was just about dollars and cents. And, he tends to do that. And he tends to be enamored by people that are rich or powerful just because they're rich or powerful. And so, I think that on the other hand, he's also has the characteristics of a Queens, New York tough guy. And that is, he pushes people around and he gets what he wants. He's a tough bargainer, but he also is ruthless at times. So, for instance, I'll tell you a story. When I was first in Toronto, my ex-husband and I started an art studio. We had very good customers. We had employees. And one day a customer came in and said, hey, you do a great job. You're doing great artwork for us. By the way, I think that we probably represent a third of your business, so we want a 10% discount. Just like that. And so that's what he's doing with his tariff policy. He's the guy who's buying everybody's stuff, knows that you're dependent on it, and he wants a discount. And it's in the form of a tariff.
But you're suggesting, in a sense, he's right. I mean, your Substack is very much focused on what's happening in Europe, the rearmament of Germany, what's happening in Ukraine. Is Trump's essential premise that the system was rotten, that the Americans were supporting the Europeans, that the Europeans weren't spending enough on arms? Is it essentially right?
Yes and no. I mean, he tends to talk in exaggerated terms. Europe was not pulling its weight. Canada too, in terms of NATO commitments. In fact, we had a Prime Minister, Trudeau, who was a joke, in my opinion. And he just sort of flouted the fact that we only pay 1% when we had committed to paying, 3% or 2.5%, whatever it was. So we were freeloading. And so was Europe. And Trump was right about that. And look what's happened. The Europeans have sort of agreed, yeah, you were right about that. And now they're all committed to paying 5%. And to in the case of Ukraine, Germany has said, we want you to send much weaponry as you can to Ukraine, and we'll pay for it, all of it, and we'll source it in the United States, so you get trade benefit out of it. So I mean, yes, it was, as I say, kind of egotistical and the result of the Second World War. And it needed to be updated and fixed, because it isn't fair to expect the American people to defend Europe, which economically speaking is as wealthy as the United States. And now they're going to get their act together. They're going to create an armed force. And then that will help in terms of the trouble with Russia and also in the Middle East.
Your last Substack piece is entitled Germany and Japan Rearm. For some people, that would be chilling, but the way you're presenting it, this is actually not such a bad thing. I mean, obviously, you're not supporting Germany or Japan's involvement in the Second World War, but are you arguing, Diane, in a way that the world is going back to normal, to a normal kind of system where countries like Germany and Japan, which have strategic and economic great power, need to rearm to rebuild a more coherent international system?
Well, again, the United States and the Allies after the Second World War decided not to leave Japan and Germany in ruins. They rebuilt them. They taught them how to be capitalist. They gave them democratic institutions to emulate. They babysat them. They nurtured them. And now you've got a situation where the United States is the biggest economy in the world. The second biggest is China. The third biggest is Germany. And the fourth biggest is Japan. I may have those two confused. But these are unbelievably wealthy economies. And they should not have to, they shouldn't be relying on the United States to protect them militarily. And to do a lot of other things for them. So I think that they're stepping up, and they should. And I think that it's the result of the generosity after the Second World War that allowed them to become rich and prosperous. And now they're finally saying, you know what? And I think this is good globally, because they're on the good side of the good guys. And, they're going to help the Western, I call it the Civilization Alliance of Western countries and others against Russia, which is the big problem.
I want to get to Russia, as you say, as the big problem in a second, but you mentioned your experience in Toronto being, so to speak, shaken down. You also write about something you call the Donroe Doctrine, obviously a play on the Monroe Doctrine. Is that what the Donroe Doctrine is, in a broader political sense, a kind of shakedown by the Don, Donald Trump?
I think so. I think the tariffs are. By the way, putting tariffs on another country or negotiating tariffs, he put tariff positions on a lot of countries, but that started negotiations. And one of the things that he was really right about behind the tariffs is that he's negotiating away the fact that a lot of people, trading partners, had non-tariff barriers preventing American goods and services from getting into their economies. And that includes Germany and Japan and Canada. So, protectionism is another thing that he's sort of, reducing by going through this tariff business. The Monroe Doctrine is a continuation of the Monroe Doctrine. And basically, that is historical, and it makes sense in a way. He's actually saying the Western Hemisphere, and that includes Greenland, all the way down to Argentina, is going to be the special regional business of America. And so it is very imperialistic in a way, but it started off with kicking out the Spanish and the Brits and the French out of the hemisphere from their colonies. But now it is sort of a different kind of situation, and I don't like it. I think he's gone a little too far with some of the things he's proposing. But on the other hand, it's an implicit protection militarily from outside the hemisphere of the countries inside the hemisphere. And it's a warning to them to treat America nicely.
Of course, you're talking to me, Diane, from Canada. You were born in the United States. What about Trump's threats or promises to incorporate Canada into the United States? Should that be taken seriously?
Absolutely. I'll just give you a quick background. In 2013, my 10th book, I've written 10 books, was Merger of the Century, Why Canada and the United States Should Become One Country. And I wasn't endorsing the merger, but I was warning Canadians that if they didn't get their acts together, grow their economies like Australia's done, which they haven't, didn't have a prime minister like Trudeau who didn't allow fossil fuels to be developed and all kinds of things, had a lousy military that they shrank and didn't meet their NATO commitments or their NORADs, that America will get fed up and gobble them up. I warned that, and none of that, of course, was heeded. And so now you have a Canada that is very weak and very dependent on the United States economically and militarily. And so Mr. Trump, being a ruthless politician / business guy, sees, like seeing a guy with an apartment building who can't meet his mortgage payments. Maybe I should buy it and I can get it cheaply. I think it's that mentality. And so he's talked about Canada in those terms. And he's the other problem with Trump is he's can't help himself. He's very insulting. And I think what's really made a lot of us, including myself, very angry is that his statement that, Canada should become the 51st state. Canada is bigger than all 50 US states, and it is resource richer than all the 50 states. So to shrug us off as the 51st state is an insult. And it's not only offended Canadians, but it's frightened many of them who don't want to be part of the United States for two principal reasons. They're lousy gun laws and they're lousy health care. They don't want any part of that.
Would it have been less insulting if you'd have said, well, there are 5 or 6 regions of Canada, so they can be our 56th, that we would have 56 states? Is the problem that he was trying to turn Canada into a single state?
Well, that was the initial insult. He could say, "I'll give you 10 states." That's not the point. I did a thought experiment with an investment banker in that book in 2013. And as of 2013, we looked at merging the two countries. And Canada is so much richer than the United States. About then, it was $17 trillion richer. That I said, for it to work, the Americans would have to pay every man, woman, and child in Canada $500,000 plus give them free health care for life in order for them to compensate for the overcontribution of wealth. It's not an equal partnership that would just simply merge that way.
And I wonder actually whether it would be the best thing that could ever happen to the Democratic Party, because it would shift the balance of political power, certainly to the left, if Canada was incorporated into the United States. Another subject,
Absolutely.
maybe another conversation, Diane, on that one. You mentioned Russia. You wrote an interesting Substack piece recently about the rotting of Russia. Russia has always been somewhat rotten under the Tsars, under Stalin, under Brezhnev. Is there something peculiarly rotten now about Russia in the international system?
Well, I think its war effort is interesting because you can't have a house rotting from within and the structure remain. The reason why it's more pertinent now is because they are engaged in this gigantic world war against everybody, basically. They started the war in Sudan. They were behind the October 7th attack of Israel. They're all over the place causing trouble.
That's a fairly controversial remark. They're behind the October the 6th. Well, in what sense? Where's your evidence for that?
Well, according to Ukrainian intelligence, first of all, October 7th is Putin's birthday. Secondly, the Hamas terrorists were trained in Syria on Russian bases by Russian mercenaries called the Wagner Troop to do that to make that attack. And so, Russia has stayed out of it, but their fingerprints are all over it. And I just don't understand why the mainstream media hadn't picked up on it. But I've written about it. Getting back to the corruption inside Russia, you've got it's so rotten that people who get inducted into the army have to bribe officers to stay out of the front line, and they're all corrupted. The officers themselves probably bribed the army to get their officer commission. And all of the military brass are, oligarchs with money all over the place. And, they're stealing money from the war effort, which I get into in the article, by creating phony companies that get military contracts. And instead of the money going to weapons and to the military, it goes to their Swiss bank accounts or their homes in Paris. So, that kind of thing cannot sustain itself and will eventually crumble.
Your Substack page is strongly recommended by a couple of mutual friends of ours, Anne Applebaum, who's been on the show, and Frank Vogel, who's an expert in financial transparency. What's your take on changes in America when it comes to cleaning up the international financial system? Anne Applebaum has also written about this.
Yeah, Anne does a great job. And of course, Frank founded Transparency International. The problem is that there is this laundry system globally, and it's conducted through banks offshore. It's conducted through all kinds of mechanisms, and it allows dirty money to be laundered from, say, Russia or the cartels, and it ends up in real estate in Manhattan, or it ends up owning factories sometimes. And it's made, billions of dollars are made, no taxes are collected on them. And the Americans and others have tried to interdict, but I think really tougher action has to be taken. You've got laundries inside Europe. You've got the Swiss bank accounts. You've got Luxembourg. You've got Ireland, where they allow numbered companies, anonymous people. They don't check the source of funds. Billions of dollars are stolen from poor countries around the world and funneled through this European system, as well as the banks in the Caribbean, some of which are Canadian and American owned. So, it is a laundromat that, perpetuates suffering and makes bad people richer than they should.
Briefly, what's your take on Trump's commitment to cryptocurrency, his investment in it, his support for different kinds of cryptocurrency initiatives? Is this likely to deepen all this laundered, dirty money?
It's at the heart of it. It's definitely at the heart of it. It's anonymous ownership. and it can be transferred through intermediaries, not proper banks that are licensed and regulated. I wrote a piece, I called it Trump's Cryptocracy, and it's all laid out there. It's very worrisome. Taking a jet plane from Qatar is one thing, but if you have huge crypto contacts and a network, money can funnel into and is funneling into that Trump family at an alarming rate from who knows where. And so that to me is a big concern. It facilitates bribery and corruption.
I know you've written lots of books, Diane. Maybe that should be the title of a new book, Trump's Cryptocracy, which of course is bound to end badly. You had another interesting piece recently, early July, on Substack about Europe should panic. But why should they panic? I take your point on the rotting of Russia, but they haven't been very successful in Ukraine. If they can't conquer Ukraine, then why should the Poles or the Czechs or the Hungarians or certainly the French or the Italian or the British, why should they worry about Russia?
They're next. They're next. That's why. You've got
the British should be worried that the Russians are going to invade.
The Russians will go after a NATO country, and then they're all involved. They will eventually go after a NATO country, and they won't just stop at Ukraine. And also, I'd submit that Putin has been conducting a hybrid war against Europe for several decades. Espionage, the Brexit vote was influenced, it looks like. You've got politicians that speak on behalf of Russia in all the platforms in all the countries. You've got political parties that are Russian supported. You've got leaders that have been very much influenced by Russia, mostly, I would say, in Germany and Hungary. And so they have been doing all kinds of things.
They could be influenced. There's no reason why they shouldn't. I mean, Russia is, for better or worse, a great power, one of the greatest, certainly, nuclear powers. It has some economic and cultural significance. Why shouldn't they be influenced by the Russians? You're beginning to sound like a Cold War hawk.
Well, I'm not a Cold War hawk, but I don't think any nation really wants an entity like Russia that's spewing lies, that's intimidating people, that is conducting assassinations, that is cyber attacking your utilities, that is cutting cables to internet, all of this stuff, and meddling, illegally sometimes in elections. And then of course there's the espionage aspect. So it's a malevolent player. I don't think it's dominating anywhere yet, but it's really caused a lot of trouble inside Europe, and this will not stop. This will just increase.
You talk about Europe panicking. I mean, some Europeans are panicking, not about the Russians, but about the Chinese. As I said, I just came back from Kenya and Zanzibar. The beautiful new airport in Zanzibar has been built by the Chinese. Why shouldn't we be panicking about the Chinese rather than the Russians, Diane? They're the coming great power. They're the AI power, enormously economically wealthy, powerful, catching up with the American economy. How does China, in your view, in your view of the world, how does this fit in?
I see a lot of people disagree with me on this. I see Russia as an enemy, as a malevolent force that wants to recreate the Soviet Union, imprison people, ignore rights, and then take over other countries and commit genocide when necessary, which it's done all along its history, including in Ukraine. China, on the other hand, is not an imperial power. It's never been a conquering country. It's been a country that has always wanted to fend off being bitten off by it. It's resisted trading relationships. It's united into one ethnic group, the Han people, for the most part, except for a couple of provinces. China, to me, is not an enemy. China is a competitor. and it can be a ruthless competitor. And yes, it should be carefully monitored and watched, but it's not an evil enemy, which I regard Russia as.
Some people might be listening to this, Diane, and thinking, well, that's all very well, but tell the Uyghurs that, or the Tibetans. What's the difference between what the Chinese have done there to what the Russians are doing in Ukraine?
No difference, I'm saying. But the China power elite are Han people based in Beijing, and they're all about, they're all about, economic competition. And yes, sure, they'd like Taiwan. Yes, they gobbled up Hong Kong. Maybe they'll get this or that. But, if they'd been a conquering nation and, like Russia, there wouldn't be a Southeast Asia.
Let's end on the Middle East. You mentioned it earlier. What's your take on what's happening now in Gaza?
It's awful. It's beyond belief that it's what's going on there. And I do believe the cameras. Yes, there may be some hyping of this and that, but I think Netanyahu is an awful leader. I think Israelis and the G7 countries are starting to realize that this just has to stop. This slaughter and this famine and this torture of people in Gaza has to stop. Israeli NGOs are speaking up. Israelis are speaking up. Jewish organizations around the world. It's just out of control, and it's wrong. That's my opinion. There's no justification for it whatsoever. And in fact, after the October massacre, which was horrific, absolutely horrific, the plan to invade Gaza with tanks and airplanes, when what they were looking for was 400 terrorists hiding in caves, was crazy. Of course, they were going to kill all kinds of innocent people in the way. They just, I just don't understand it, and I think it's going to go down as the dark spot, one of the darkest moments in history.
Let's end, Diane, where we began, with Canada. You made it clear you're no great fan of Trudeau. What do you make of the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney? He's been quite forthright. He stood up, or at least appeared to stand up, to Trump. Are you enthusiastic about him? Is he the kind of person who will strengthen Canadian position in the world? And can the world learn from Canada? Lots of jokes about the boring Canadians, but perhaps the world needs to be more boring, like Canada.
Well, that would be nice, actually. Carney is early in the job. He's not equipped. He's somewhat like Trump in that respect. He has no experience as a politician. That may be a good thing.
Isn't that a good thing?
Maybe, maybe not. He's a banker. He's a civil servant. He's a technocrat. And he was also an accomplice to the terrible government that Trudeau delivered for a decade to Canadians. He's also a radical environmentalist, like his wife. And, I very much am concerned that, the kind of green radicalism that has impaired Canada for 10 years under Trudeau will continue under Carney. He's making noises otherwise, but let's see. But when your country has to develop resources and has some of the best resource base in the world, and no reason to apologize for how we get it out of the ground, by the way, you can't have somebody in there who just says fossil fuels are evil and everybody should stop driving a car. So I worry about his background and his pedigree and his coziness with the incompetence of the Trudeau government before. But I wish him well, and I think he may learn.
In other words, you don't really care for him. You've written about the Donroe Doctrine. Maybe we should talk about a Diane Doctrine, Diane.
Oh, goodness. I don't know what that would be.
Well, I think we've heard it. Excellent conversation. You are not shy to express your opinions. Really appreciate it, Diane. And as I said, you run an excellent Substack. It's dianefrancis.substack.com. So best of luck with that. And we'll talk again. Lots more to talk about in international politics. Thank you so much.